Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin can and string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from many blogs and many podcasts around the internet, including from Cover 32 and Optimum Scouting. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, how is the weather in Minneapolis at this particular minute?
At the minute, much better than the weather up north where you are.
Yes, thank you. I had to drive in absolute terror this afternoon, so that was fun. That nothing like 8 inches of snow to just change your output on like how a day is going to go. It's my fault for not paying attention to like the weather this morning when I woke up and went, well, it's like raining this morning. This is weird. Okay, it's a little off-putting, but it's raining, fine. And then cue to like 3 hours later as I'm looking out into the whiteout blizzard and just like looking for a van in front of me going, okay, so if I follow them, I'm not going in the ditch. I'll be fine.
Jesus.
Yeah.
That's so Minnesotan, that story. Oh yeah, it was raining, and then it turned to ice, and we almost died. So
like it could have been could have been like full on like thunderstorm on the way to work this morning, and I would have gone, yeah, this makes sense.
Exactly.
God, it's something off-putting about driving to work at 7 o'clock in the morning in a driving rain in December that just puts you in an odd mood. I don't know what it is, but just you end up in an odd mood after that. But I did end up, when I came home, I ended up making the brisket I had left in the fridge, and that was the best decision I've made all day. Much better than the decision to actually drive to work this morning. So I'm doing quite well as a result. The neighbors are knocking on the door and asking who's cooking, so it's great. Welcome to this episode of Norse Code, where we will go over plenty of things, including the win over the Falcons and Carson Wentz losing against Seattle, because it is what you, the listener, will demand us talk about. So of course. So we've got a lot of things to talk about, a lot of things to go over. But before we get too deep into it, we would just like to thank you guys so much for listening to the show, for getting the word out about Norse Code, helping us have a very successful season, and for the donations that we've been receiving. So we just have a couple of donations to go over. Again, these are big thank yous to you guys because we are ad-free. We are supported by you guys. We don't want to have 10 minutes of an ad roll or stop in the middle of our Falcons review to start talking about a different product or something. Nope, we are all funded by you guys. So before we begin, just want to talk a little bit about patreon.com. We have a donation from Raistlin Hart. We believe that's how it's pronounced, so that's what it's going to be today.
If James got it wrong, it's my fault. I suggested that pronunciation after we struggled with it for a while, mostly because that's also a name of one of my favorite characters in a fantasy novel. So if that's wrong, blame nerds. So.
If that's wrong, Arif doesn't want to be right. It's kind of how that ends up working out. So thank you for the Patreon donation. You have qualified for the sticker, so Dusty will be getting that out to you as well. And we have a couple of other donations as well coming from PayPal. If you would like to donate to us via PayPal, you can do it at paypal.me/Norse Code. Jack Kelly sends in from PayPal, and he says, "Keep up the good work on the show. If I wasn't a broke student loan paying millennial, I'd send more money. I love listening to you guys go back and forth, and it makes every drive more enjoyable and relaxing. I've learned more about the ins and outs of football strategy and positions in the last few months listening to Norse Code than my whole life combined. Thank you for all that you guys do, Jack." Thanks so much, Jack. Again, we really appreciate the donation and helping out, as both of us are student loan paying millennials as well.
Yeah, appreciate it. Also, totally understand if most of your money has to go to avocado toast. Completely reasonable.
completely reasonable. Actually, I was reading something where they were declaring that people that are just like a little too old to be considered traditional millennials and hate the term like extennial or whatever the hell they're called now.
Oh God, is it like Generation X and Millennial? Just kind of
yeah.
Oh God,
Like I shouldn't qualify, but I do because I'm an 83 and like the cutoff's like 80, so it's weird.
Right.
But like there are some of us that are going by the Oregon Trail generation.
See, I think Dusty and I have mentioned this like 4 times in the show now, but the difference between a digital native and a digital adopter or something like that, which like can subdivide the millennials.
Yeah, pretty much. It's the difference between like growing up with it and just knowing it immediately and just knowing when to Google.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Other donations that we should quick mention, Barrett Damien, which I love. I love that name. That sounds like a bounty hunter.
That's a great name.
Either in real life or in Star Wars, like Barrett Damien.
Oh, that's true. It's one of those names that works equally well in like real life and Star Wars. That's pretty rare.
That is very rare. But he says, keep up the good work, and we shall. And Maxwell Peterson, also through PayPal. Again, thank you guys so much for helping executive produce this week's episode. I say this week's episode every time I'm on. It's my episode for the week, darn it. Later in the week.
2 episodes a week, dude.
I know, right? I'm the producer. I feel like I should know this. Arif and Dusty will be back later in the week to be reviewing a few things and to be previewing the Carolina game. So again, we have 2 episodes this week. I just like to say this week's episode for no particular reason, apparently. So those are our donations. Again, thank you guys so much for helping out. Really do appreciate it. If you'd like to donate to the show, you can do it at patreon.com/Norse Code or paypal.me/Norse Code. Again, every dollar helps us keep the lights on, helps us keep going throughout the year, and we may be planning a couple of things for later in January, maybe. So we are kind of keeping that kind of close to the chest, and we want the Vikings to do well. So let's keep things quiet about potentially important games later in the year. So all that aside, let us move on to the game. Let's talk about the win over the Falcons. And this was a hell of a game. This had playoff atmosphere and playoff implications written all over it. Before we start, we spent a lot of time talking about the officials in the Lions game. I just wanted to start off this episode and just ask how we feel the officiating was this game comparatively, because there were a lot of flags thrown in this particular game.
I mean, comparatively, I would say that this was an improvement. It just like, I think the bigger issue for me was the flow of the game being interrupted so often by the penalties, more than it was like this. Fundamentally, it just feels like they're calling the game in one particular direction or anything like that. I think that, both teams got, a little bit, I'm not going to say screwed, but I think got a little bit too much out of the refs, as it were. I think the safeties drew 3 blocks in the back.
It seemed like the Falcons were getting like block in the back penalties every series, and you just go there and like, how the hell is that even possible? Right.
Yeah, and I don't think it is. I think the Vikings benefited from a couple of calls. I think the Falcons certainly benefited from a couple of calls, and in a game that's like pretty close, like 14-9, you feel like, hey, maybe that materially affected the outcome if, some of those calls came at critical times for one team but not the other. I don't think that they did. I think that the Vikings, despite kind of looking shaky at some points in the first half, I think the Vikings demonstrated they were the better team. And I think the Falcons genuinely did kind of like, shoot themselves in the foot a lot, with like drops and some penalties that were pretty clearly penalties and stuff like that. And I think a lot of Falcons fans that you would talk to, I think, kind of agree that, yeah, there were a lot of penalties, that the refs were a little bit too easy by calling those penalties, but that the Falcons ultimately hurt themselves a lot in those circumstances. So, I don't like the officiating, but it wasn't biased.
Yeah, in the end, it didn't feel like anything was as bad as say, last week or anything, but it still was. It was worth kind of mentioning anyway because of how present the referees were. By the way, I do want to apologize for those listening and hearing the random beeping. They are literally getting 8 inches of snow out of our parking lot. So just apologies, as this is North Dakota, Minnesota weather, and occasionally we're podcasting under under less than ideal circumstances. Just for anybody listening here. So let's get to the game and getting to Keenum. Keenum got hit a couple of times in the game, certainly got sacked a couple of times in the game, but it looked like he had a fair amount of time to throw the ball and seemed to be able to go through his progressions, especially in the second half when he was ostensibly perfect. What made him so effective in the game, and how was the play of the offensive line?
Oh, it's kind of interesting. So, it seems like he either had a lot of time in the pocket and he was willing to take advantage of it, or he had no time in the pocket and there was not really like a middle ground, right? It's kind of like, how the Vikings running game has been this year, although not in this game. The Vikings running game was generally pretty successful. But just in general, it felt like, he was under a lot of pressure, but in those snaps, the pressure came pretty quickly. And then if he wasn't getting, going to be under pressure, he was going to hold on to the ball for a while. As the game progressed, they kind of changed their approach to the game, which was fine. Early on, I thought Keenum was pretty shaky. I thought, before the 2-minute drill, he was averaging 5 yards an attempt. He had a 60% completion rate. The passes he did complete, had some pretty errant ball placement, and they restrict the opportunities to create yards after the catch. I think that those, were problems. And the 2-minute drive starts, and it's a really meaningless drive that, it generates a lot of, additional, like, kind of free yardage for Keenum that, I guess you could say pads his stats, which is not, I don't like saying that because it's clearly not his goal. But, the Falcons gave him the middle of the field and he took it, and it took a ton of time off the clock. And so I think it was poorly managed as a 2-minute drill by Keenum. But, and that brought his, yards per attempt up to 6.5, which is kind of absurd that it improved it that much.
Yeah.
He finishes that half with 2 straight completions, and then the second half is 13 straight completions. So he's on a 15 completion streak, which, a lot of people will be like, well, that's pretty good evidence that he improved, it's all right evidence that he improved for sure. But I don't think it's a good evidence that, like, it's like the Washington or the Rams game, or even the Browns game, where it's a tale of two halves. Like, I think, in the Washington game, astounding first half, just mediocre second half. Browns game, pretty bad first half, pretty good second half, that kind of thing. I don't think it was that. I don't think in the first half it was like, abysmal. In the second half it was great. I thought the first half was bad and the second half was adequate. Like, it wasn't like, we were very split apart. And I think a lot of it had to do with the play calling. There were no passes completed over 20 yards. All 3 attempts over 20 yards were in the first half. I guess that's a logical conclusion from he didn't complete any passes over 20 yards and he completed every pass in the second half. But to clarify, yes, that's what that means. And so it was a very, very conservative game plan that relied a lot on yards after the catch, which, normally you'd be like, I don't know, he doesn't place the ball well. But on the short passes, he did a pretty good job putting the ball in the right spot to create yards after the catch. But it did take a burden off of him, and it took a huge burden off the offensive line, which was willing to give up a ton of pressure. Especially, up the middle to Grady Jarrett, who had a pretty good game, their defensive tackle. And Adrian Claiborne was able to get some pressure. Tack McKinley, obviously, he got a sack. It was not a great performance, I think, from a pass protection standpoint from the offensive line. I thought as run blockers, they did all right. This is one of the few games where there was only 1 running back carry for negative yardage. There were 3 more for 0 yards and 3 kneel downs, and so that technically counts as a negative yard rush. But it was extremely good. They were extremely good at preventing tackles for loss in that game, and credit to the offensive line there for sure. And I think credit to Latavius Murray, who everyone probably remembers the bigger run, where he was compared to Le'Veon Bell, by Charles Davis, but. I think that Murray did a lot of his own creation too. He had a great success rate in the game. I think his best success rate for the year. And he had a pretty decent yards per carry. And usually you don't see that with Latavius Murray style back. It's either, pretty good yards per carry and low success rate or vice versa. So that was good to see.
It was interesting to watch him hit people in stride, which seemed to be kind of the theme because, as you said, these were a lot of the way we were moving the ball was more like yards after catch. It wasn't just throw up and to the sideline, although Thielen tried to make 2 of those catches, and that didn't end up working out. But he just kept on hitting people in stride, and it was working really well for us.
Yeah, no, especially in that second half, because the first half he was having some difficulty getting it in stride, and there are other issues too. You had receivers running wide open that he wouldn't target and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely in the second half, he was able to put the ball in places that allowed those offensive players to continue moving it forward. And it's a big reason why the running backs had a big impact in the passing game. I think they had like 58 passing yards. The running backs accounted for some 80-odd% of the Vikings offense in that game. And I think a lot of it has to do with how effective they were in short passing. C.J. Ham was a big part of the short passing game. Obviously Jerick McKinnon and Latavius Murray were. And they were able to generate those yards after the catch because, I think the ball was put in good spots for them. Plus, sometimes they were just not covered by the Atlanta linebackers, which, that's always a plus.
Yeah, I mean, and Treadwell and Jarius Wright as well contributed both on third down, and both were relatively uncovered and just were able to get them into the right spot. I guess the next question I have is more about play style. And there was a lot of play action in this game. And we've seen it over the year that Case Keenum and Pat Shurmur seem to be working a really nice play action progress. Can you walk us through kind of how this ends up working, how you're able to sell the defense on the run as well as we've been doing this year, and how we're able to curl back, find our receiver, or dump it off to either Murray or McKinnon?
So there's actually a couple of elements to the way the Vikings design their offense that helps sell that play action. One thing that people like to say is when you run the ball well, it increases, your ability to sell play action. And the evidence for that is not particularly strong, but I think the way that we define how we run the ball well is also one of the reasons that the evidence isn't very strong. Generally speaking, when you've got a pretty good success rate on the run, you can do a better job, throwing the ball and in particular doing a better job on play action. So some of it has to do with how successful they were in play action or in the run game. But beyond that, there was something else. And it was kind of interesting because David Morgan was concussed pretty early. So we thought that, maybe they wouldn't be able to deploy the normal formations they would deploy in order to help sell play action, because the only reason play action ever works is because they think you're going to run the ball. Sometimes that has to do with how often you run it. Sometimes it has to do with how well you run it. Sometimes it has to do with how you indicate what play you're going to do before the snap starts. So sometimes that comes in formation. Sometimes that comes with personnel. When you've got 3 tight ends out there, it's really easy to sell play action because very, very few people pass out of a 3 tight end formation. And so the Vikings have used that a lot. I mean, they're the most play action heavy team in the NFL right now on a percentage basis. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they've got 2 tight ends or 3 tight ends out there. And those tight ends do a really good job of selling a block and then getting open upfield. So that's a big part of it. And when David Morgan, was out with a concussion, they put Blake Bell in there, and they'd even include Jeremiah Searles as a 6th offensive lineman / eligible receiver / tight end kind of, and that would help sell play action too. And so some of that's through formation, but a lot of it has to do with what the players do in order to sell play action. And so, the offensive linemen up front, and in particular the centers and guards, because that's who linebackers key in on. Hopefully, sometimes, linebackers that aren't being, coached as well or have a little bit more difficulty, retaining their keys will peek into the backfield. But for the most part, they're supposed to read the offensive linemen. So what the offensive linemen do on play action, that's a big part of it. So they have to do a pretty good job of selling the run, which, some people would argue is a little bit easier to do in a zone scheme. I think that there's not a ton of evidence that play action works better in zone plays, but, you can pass protect a lot easier if you flow to the sideline and you don't have to worry about not being 2-3 yards downfield when the ball is thrown. That's a big problem with play action, is that you have to sell a run without getting too far upfield. But the offensive linemen have done a good job, and also Case Keenum has done a fantastic job of selling play action, because a lot of it comes down to quarterback ball handling and stuff like that. So all of those elements have been a big part of how the Vikings have been so successful. Faking a run play and how, why they use it so often. because they really do build their offense kind of just out of the threat of running the ball, despite the fact that they don't have Dalvin Cook anymore.
Yeah, and it's gone really, really well, obviously, over the past several games, and we're being very successful with it. I wanted to bring it up because I watched as the Falcons attempted to use play action on their part, and we're kind of skipping ahead to how the Falcons' offense was doing, but I noticed that the Vikings were not biting a lot on their play action attempts.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of that has to do with film analysis, because I don't think that Alex Mack is particularly poor at selling play action, and the Falcons did a pretty good job last year of doing it. But I think that the Falcons, they would operate out of play action in situations that they were probably not running out of, right? On like 3rd and long, like no one's going to believe that you're running the ball. And so,
except on the occasion that they did, and it worked, and ended up getting played back, or ended up getting brought back on a penalty. Like totally caught us with our pants down. It's
pretty awful. Yeah. And I guess that's kind of the benefit to not believing that you're going to run the ball, that eventually when you do, it works. But the Falcons just didn't do a very good job of figuring out when they were going to operate out of play action. They also didn't do a very good job of just selling it. I don't think that the personnel that they put out there were strong indications that they will run. Like the Vikings have committed sort of like every element of how one reads a play to implicate play action, and so when you see other teams do it not so successfully, it kind of shows. The Vikings were pretty fooled on play action against the Rams, and they're a team that operated to play action the second most often in the NFL behind the Vikings. And so they do know how to sell it. They do a pretty good job, and the Vikings aren't kind of immune to it. But I think a lot of it has to do with, how the Falcons as a whole do not do as good of a job selling, the run fake. And the Vikings are pretty good at this kind of film analysis.
So let's move on to the McKinnon catch for the touchdown, which seemed a bit like a pick and roll set by Rudolph. How was that play set up, and why was that successful?
Yeah, I mean, the Vikings were in a pretty good sort of matchup anyway. You had McKinnon in the slot, and his job is to get to the outside. And it felt like it was kind of a favorable matchup for the Vikings in general. I think he was up against a linebacker, I want to say. Somebody he's much quicker than, despite sort of all the speed that they have on that defense. And it just so happens to help that Kyle Rudolph ran, right over top of the crosser, and maybe a defender couldn't navigate the traffic. It was a pick play. They did a pretty good job of getting McKinnon open. Obviously, it's not a sort of true pick play in that the ball wasn't ready to fire in the air yet or anything like that. So it's not like it was pass interference or anything like that. But it was smart, and we've seen defenses do a better job of covering that sort of thing. Famously, the Patriots are very good at avoiding those kinds of pick plays after, complaining about them, I guess, back in 2015.
Yeah.
But they're very, very good at dealing with it. And, I guess the Falcons are not. We actually also saw that in the Super Bowl, so I guess that's not a huge change from last year. And it was just a way to get McKinnon out into space. He was, wide open as a result of the trailing linebacker. He probably would have been open against that guy kind of regardless. Didn't look like he was, playing very fast. So, it was just, pretty good play call. The play calling in the red zone has been fantastic. The Vikings have converted 15 of the last 16 red zone trips into touchdowns. They're number one in the league in red zone conversion rate since the bye. And they've moved to number 5 overall for the year. Which is a pretty good, stark contrast from 2016 when they were awful at it. They were in the bottom 5, I'm pretty sure, in red zone conversion percentage.
So the defense for the Falcons, it looked slow on that play, and it certainly looked slow on the Rudolph touchdown as well, where of all people, speed demon Kyle Rudolph was just sitting there basically untouched.
Yeah, no, I mean, his athleticism was a big part of him being able to get open. Right. I'm not as confident as to what happened on that touchdown. I think it was one of the few sort of plays in at the goal line where the Vikings chose not to use play action. So it was just kind of a straight kind of bread and butter passing play, and he just got open. I probably should rewatch that touchdown to see kind of exactly what happened. But from my initial reading, my initial perspective, like he just found a way open. Keenum threw it high just in case somebody was going to get there in time. They didn't, and Rudolph caught it and touchdown.
Hooray! How big was Quigley's punt as for setting up that first touchdown for the Vikings?
Oh, it was enormous. It was one of those like classic coffin corners. You get like, I think Eric Thompson tweeted out 500 points in Madden for that. I don't think current Madden have the coffin corner, or is that like only Madden 08 and stuff? Well,
the way that they set it up was, like in the skills competition thing, you can still play it. Yeah, I have the newest Madden, and you can still set up like skills competition things and hit the corner. Yeah, and it's still annoying as hell to do sometimes. Where you're sitting there just going, no, that went out of bounds at the 10. That didn't go out of bounds at the 25. Come on, give me it. No, you're still arguing with a TV screen half the time.
Yeah, right. A computer that's like perfectly tracking every element on the screen. You're like, come on.
You're like, no, game is broken.
But yeah, the coffin corner putt put them at the 2.
I don't remember if it was the 2 or it was within the 5. I remember that. It was either the 2 or the 4. It was really close to the end zone.
It was a phenomenal punt, and he's been having an iffy year, but that was a great punt. No, yeah, that was really perfect because it forced the Vikings, because I don't think it was a 3 and out, but it was pretty close to that. Allowed the Vikings to force a punt very soon after, and it gave them great field position. They didn't have to drive very far to get that first touchdown.
And especially because we were trying to get the special teams to be better than last game, according to the rants that Mike Zimmer had from after llast game.
Yeah, and rightly so. The special teams unit in the last game was garbage. But yeah, it's interesting. That they talked to Mike Zimmer, and the media is like, hey, so you sucked at the red zone last year, or you weren't that efficient at the red zone early in the year. Now you're one of the most efficient teams in the red zone. And he's like, yeah, we just practiced it. And it's like, oh, really? That
so you didn't last year? I feel like that should have been brought up at some point.
Right.
How was that not a thing?
Other teams definitely practice red zone. Like, there's no way you're the only, like, you're the most, there's got to be another thing. It's like, yeah, we just practice it. The special teams got a lot better. What happened? We just practice special teams. It's like, well, yeah, I guess.
I just wanted Coach of the Year so badly this year that I wanted to tank last year. You got to trust the process, Arif.
How can you recruit if you don't got that hardware? Coach of the Year right here.
Best thing I read today, by the way, is that Ben McAdoo has been fired by the Giants. Like, oh, that means Ben McAdoo to Tennessee confirmed.
Jesus,
you can bring that Razor Ramon haircut down there.
Arizona State freaking hired Herm Edwards, and Tennessee still doesn't have a coach. Like, what?
They don't have as far as I know, they don't have an athletic director either, but that's kind of here nor there.
I think they hired Phil Fulmer, which is also hilarious.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Viking special teams unit and red zone offense just in general have been a big part of the way the offense has, or the way that, sort of the team has been able to generate consistency on offense in a way that, kind of belies sort of the underlying dynamics of what might create unsustainability. So, like, for example, you don't expect to be able to get a couple of touchdowns in a game where you're struggling passing the ball, and when you do pass the ball, it's pretty short and stuff like that. But with a red zone offense that efficient, you can afford to only make a couple of trips to the red zone in the first place.
Yeah. So let's mention Latavius Murray, who had a very successful day. He was looking, and I don't want to use this I don't want to use his name in the negative context here, but he looked a bit like Adrian Peterson for a little while in that he was craving contact on some of these runs. Like, it almost seemed like he didn't want to end his run until he hit somebody. Yeah,
no, for sure. He did a really good job. The nice thing about Murray this year versus some of the stuff we saw in Oakland last year and a couple of years before is that his response to contact, I don't think he's ever been more or less tough this year versus last year. I don't think it's like a toughness thing. But I think in response to contact, he does a better job kind of lowering his pads and driving through people. And that, like, feels powerful. And so you can, because it generates more power. And so I think it's just easier to kind of crave or want to lower the boom on players when you know you've been more successful this year doing it. And it's good stuff. And even early in the year, even when I was defending Murray early in the year, he wasn't doing a very good job generating extra yards after contact. And in this game, he did a pretty good job. And it's one of the reasons, I think he had a success rate of like 56% or something like that, which that doesn't sound very high. It's actually quite high for a running back, because running backs don't tend to be successful 50% of the time on average. Like it's very, especially this year. This year's been a bad year for running the ball. And so, for him to hit 56%, that's, it's not like, on a game-to-game basis, you can get some running backs that sometimes hit 70 or something like that. But it's pretty high, and, it's pretty good. And what was interesting is I think his longest run was like, was it 13 yards or something like that? So for him to average, or no, maybe I'm thinking of Devonta Freeman.
I think you're thinking of Freeman because
I'm thinking of Freeman. Yeah, there was a 30-yard run.
Yeah, there was a 30-yard run there.
Yeah. But no, even if you sort of take the 30-yard run away, he did a pretty good job, keeping sort of the ball on schedule and keeping the Vikings ahead of the chains. It's been a really good 4-game stretch for him.
Before we mention the Falcons offense and the Vikings defense, I want to break down the 2-minute drill that the Vikings put in at the end of the first half. Do we know what they were trying to do? Because I wonder, considering all of the throws to the middle of the field during a 2-minute drill.
Yeah, I thought that was ill-advised, and it turned out to be.
I'm yelling at the TV screen. You're like, I didn't have any idea what the hell that the last throw seemed like a desperation. Like, okay, I can't throw this away. I just have to throw it in the middle of the field, sort of thing, to Michael Floyd. But still, what the hell?
Yeah. Good. It was very poorly managed. And, if you want to talk about sort of the areas of weakness that the team needs to improve before the playoffs start, I would probably go there. I generally don't have a ton of confidence in Keenum when it comes to the 2-minute drill, which is kind of weird because you want quarterbacks to let loose a lot more. In that situation, you need to be more aggressive in the 2-minute drill. It's why, until, last year, Aaron Rodgers was very poor at comebacks in the 2-minute drill versus, say, Peyton Manning or Tom Brady in the same situation. And it's because, he was risk averse. He was not willing to push the ball downfield, and it kind of hurt their opportunities. Keenum's not like that. He's never been like that. He's always kind of wanted to push the ball downfield. But in this case, he was way too safe. And the problem with avoiding a turnover to create a safe throw for the purposes of completing the pass, is that it hurts your opportunities to actually score, right? Because, the clock keeps running and stuff like that. So, yeah, I can't give you a synopsis of what he was thinking or what the Vikings offense
justify their terrible play.
But, it felt like, he wasn't kind of aware of what he needed to do in that situation. And it's not that he wasn't aware that they were in the middle of a 2-minute drill. He clearly was. They played with urgency, but he wasn't aware of what he needed to do kind of in response to that. And I guess having urgency is a good change from 2 years ago, where really felt like Turner was not a guy that instilled urgency into the 2-minute offense. But there's urgency. It just doesn't feel like there's kind of an execution upon that urgency and a knowledge that, you have to find ways to stop the clock, because they clearly didn't.
No, that was odd at best. It was just weird to watch and frustrating, especially when we start off the 2-minute drill with a draw play.
Yeah, Jesus Christ.
It's like, really? That's how we're gonna go? We're I don't feel like we have the score, guys. We've got 7 points.
And it's so weird because when you hear the way coaches talk about the decisions they make in the red zone, for example, why'd you kick the field goal instead of going for it? Then we're like, oh, points are at a premium in this game. You got to take what points you can. And it's like, okay, well, if that's true, and in this game it would be true. And that's also a problem with the Falcons. They took the points, right? They should have gone for it on 4th and 4 before the Vikings kind of final drive of the game. But okay, so let's say you're kind of risk averse and you want to take the points and stuff like that. If that's the case, why would you friggin' run a draw up the middle on your first play of the 2-minute drill?
Especially when you don't get the ball and to start the next half.
Right, like you're going to be out in opportunity to get ahead of the tempo of the game, and so they didn't. It was so weird that they willingly just like took the hit on an opportunity to score points, and that also obviously it hurt them too because that final pass, Adam Thielen might have gone down instead of trying to score if they had 15 more seconds, right? Because then they would have been able to set up a spike and a long kick. I think they would have been in range for a long kick, or a spike and a quick pass to get the ball into field position, that sort of thing, right? But they didn't, and I think the draw is just as a part of why that 2-minute drill failed as continuing to pass safe short, not that short, but safe throws in the middle of the field. That was weird.
Just odd. Let's talk about the Falcons offense versus the Vikings defense. And the thing that stuck out to me was the play of Matt Ryan, who it looked like was trying to work quicker than normal. Like if you watch Falcons games, typically he takes an extra second or two to throw the ball. But this game, it seemed like he was getting happy feet, like he was hearing footsteps, like he was just trying to get the ball out a little quicker than normal. And as a result, balls were sailing over his receivers' heads or were going in directions that didn't seem to make any sense to people who were watching, let alone the fact that his receivers were dropping the ball as well. What was happening with Matt Ryan? Was it just that he felt the pressure coming?
Yeah, no, I think the pressure was a big part of it. I think all four members of the Vikings starting front four got pressure in that game, which is not an unusual statistic, but it is a good demonstration of where that pressure was coming from. Everson Griffin did a great job. I think he got a hit and 3 quarterback hurries. I think Danielle Hunter, also got a hit. And Tom Johnson and Linval Joseph kind of both overproduced for their positions in terms of creating pressure. And so it was a difficult pocket for Matt Ryan to operate out of. We also saw, I think, some cornerback blitzes. I want to say Mackenzie Alexander blitzed once or twice. And I'm pretty sure, we saw Anthony Barr blitz more than a couple of times, and he was able to generate pressure. And just in general, it was a compressed pocket, and it was something where he was forced to get rid of the ball quickly, and he just, I'm not going to say he collapsed or anything like that, but he did a very poor job of putting the ball in a position where the receivers were able to best get it. Which is not to say, of course, like you mentioned, there were drops in the game. I think there were 3 obvious drops, maybe 1 or 2 more that I'm missing. But the drops tended to be kind of like a 50-50 split of credit, where Matt Ryan put the ball in a spot where it's just very difficult to catch. The receiver was able to put himself into a position where, he put 2 hands on the ball and then he wasn't able to bring it down. It was unusual relative to what the Falcons normally do, or at least compared to last year or the past 3 games, where they've done a very good job of kind of efficient execution. In this game, both the receivers, literally like dropped the ball, and the quarterback just did a poor job of kind of rising above the circumstances around him.
One thing we were able to do was keep the Falcons' running game completely under control. How were we able to contain Freeman the way we did?
Well, it's interesting because you take a look at the box score and you think, he wasn't really contained, right? It's 6.2 yards per attempt. Like we mentioned earlier in the show, the longest rush was like 13 yards, which means that, he seemed pretty successful. But then you consider that he actually did have, some pretty big runs on downs that kind of didn't matter, like 2nd and 25. Like who cares, right? If you've got like a 7-yard run on 2nd and 25. And so, a lot of it is really just about what the Vikings defensive line did. I think this is another game where, Anthony Barr might have played well. Eric Kendricks played kind of poorly, actually. But the defensive line, I thought, played really well. Early on, Linval Joseph showed up. I think he had like a monster tackle for loss to begin the game. And it's always funny because you can kind of almost tell the quality of the commentating you're going to get in the game based off of how the commentators react to like Linval Joseph's first play of the game, whenever that is. And in this one, Kevin Burkhardt took like ages to identify that it was Linval Joseph who made the play. He was like, big hit by the Vikings, defensive line, monster hit, tackle for loss by That was Joseph, Linval Joseph.
I'm just so used to the two of them being the commentators on the newest Madden that after a while, I think the game has just conditioned me, and maybe this is why they do it. The game has just conditioned me to give them the benefit of the doubt and be like, okay, well, this is a simulation, so I can't get too mad at them, but. And then when you hear them on an actual game, you're like, okay, well, this is still just a simulation, so I can't get too upset.
Right, I can't get too mad.
No. Like their mistake on the on whether or not that was running into the kicker or if that was a hold, or not even mentioning that it could potentially be a hold on the kicking team for that punt.
Yeah, or calling Mackenzie Alexander Trey Waynes.
Yeah, that
calling Case Keenum Adam Thielen several times.
several times, or 3rd and long on 2nd and 8 or 2nd and 5 or something.
Or my favorite actually might have been just Charles Davis insisting that 3rd and long was an advantage for the defense, as if nobody had already kind of figured that out.
I'm reminded of a scene from Game of Thrones where one of the characters said, yes, but chaos can also lead to opportunity, and one of the other main characters goes, you say that as if you're the first man to think it.
Yeah, exactly, right. And saying it once, it's like, yeah, an announcer needs to fill time in with talk, 3rd and long, real advantage for the Vikings defense. And he said it 8 times, and you're like, well, you must have really stumbled onto something there, dude.
You might want to write a book.
You should sell that to coaches in an analytics package, man. Just getting them in 3rd and long. But yeah, it was a good run performance, I think, from the defensive line. I thought Everson Griffin, I don't think he got a tackle for loss. Maybe he got one, but he was astounding, I think, in run support. And he did a really good job, setting the edge and preventing runs to the sideline. And for a lot of the game, they didn't even run in his direction. I remember early on, I had kind of noticed that there were no runs to the Falcons left, the Vikings right. And it wasn't until kind of I think midway through the 2nd quarter that I think I remember the first run to Everson Griffin's side. But yeah, when they didn't do a very good job. And I thought early in the game, Jake Matthews was actually doing a pretty good job against Everson Griffin. Eventually, that didn't really turn out to be the case because Griffin ended up getting some pressure kind of later on. But early on, I thought that kind of success rate in pass protection would at least lead to a run in his direction and give them, I think, a little bit more opportunity to give Jake Matthews room, because you run in a defensive end, direction. Maybe the very next play he's going to be a little bit more cautious. Who knows? But they didn't, and he did a very, very good job defending the run and creating space for those linebackers to make plays. So yeah, it was a solid performance in the run game for the Vikings, kind of despite the fact that Devonta Freeman ended up with over 6 yards a carry, just because it was kind of tough going for them to be able to kind of exploit useful yards out of those running backs. I think they did end up with over 100 rushing yards for the game, but it's pretty meaningless rushing yards.
Yeah. Anybody who watched that game would come away with the idea that they were able to run the ball a little while, but it didn't really do them much good. It didn't really set up anything other than a couple of field goals, which, if we're going to talk about field goals, we can even mention the miss by Matt Bryant and how huge that was.
Yeah, I still won my fantasy games. I think all of them, which is it's been a while since I've swept. I think people who see Don from Ohio's comments about the Norse Code Fantasy League will know that I haven't swept a weekend in a while, but Matt Bryant's on all my teams, and despite that miss, I won. Everyone loves talking about their own fantasy teams. He
not me. I do not like talking about my fantasy team.
You talk about your other fake one all the time. I don't know what you're talking about,
I am doing very well in the other league. I lost this week because apparently Cam Newton was a better play against New Orleans than Tom Brady is against against Buffalo, which is not something I would have expected. Yeah, Jesus. My bad.
But it was kind of interesting. I think right after the kick, they were like, "Wow, rare miss from Matt Bryant. He hasn't missed a single field goal this year from 40 to 49." Like, yeah, karma, huh? Which, that's clearly not karma. It's not the 1998 NFC Championship game.
Well, they did honor that kicker. So I mean,
actually, it's karma for bringing it up in the game.
Yeah.
That's
multiple
screw
times.
You guys for putting it on the jumbotron there.
Yeah, they brought it up multiple times. I was like, yeah, this is kind of your fault at this point.
Yeah. So karma for bringing it up. Certainly not any sort of cosmic payback for pushing a team out of the Super Bowl. There's a lot more reckoning for that later. But yeah, I guess maybe 28-3 might be that. It doesn't feel like a win, so I'm not going to count it. But yeah, it was baffling because he shouldn't have had to kick that anyway, right? Like, they should have gone for it. Like, the way the Vikings were able to control time of possession, like the Vikings before the final drive, they had a 5-minute lead in time of possession, which that's not a stat I usually care about. It doesn't correlate with winning. Chip Kelly was right to kind of bag on it. But in the situation where you're kind of evaluating time, it suddenly becomes a relevant unit of analysis. And in this case, the Vikings have been able to sustain drives. Both their touchdown drives were 9 plays and 14 plays, and they took pretty significant time off the clock. The Vikings were playing a very slow game. They only had 8 drives the entire game, which is really unusual. The average team last year had something like 12 and a half drives. This year it's a little bit slower, closer to 11 and a half. But, the average team is 12 drives. That means there's usually 24, 25 drives in a game. And in this game, there were 17. And so, and it's not like I expect coaches to like have all of those stats real time, like on their data, on their freaking Microsoft Surface, whatever it is. Like, I don't expect them to just pull up the drive statistics that are being real time updated, which I don't think is a thing that they are allowed to do anyway. But I do expect them to kind of have a feeling for the game. And the feeling of the game is that the Vikings have been pretty good at draining the clock. And so it was particularly dumb of them to, like, the Vikings were 50% on third down. They're the top, I guess, now third down offense in the NFL, and they thought they could force a 3 and out. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, the Falcons, your offense should be better than your defense. You should have gone for it. It's 4th and 4, not an easy sort of 4th down, but it's also like not a particularly difficult one. Yeah, freaking and the field goal does nothing. Like, it would have been 14-12 instead of 14-9.
And as we've shown over the years, that if you put yourself in a position where you are relying on your kicker to win you the game, and only your kicker to win you the game, you're not going to win the game.
Right, especially like if you're choosing. Like, that's the thing. Yeah. Like, it's like sometimes you're in a position where you have to rely on your kicker, but you're choosing this life, man.
Have some self-respect. Have some dignity. Go for it on 4th down.
Which, yeah, I'm glad they didn't.
Oh, yeah. But while we're talking about 4th down, let's bring up 3rd down and their inability to convert. That was the story of the game. That was the story of the Vikings defense, allowing 1 conversion the entire game.
Yeah, one 3rd down conversion. I think they allowed 1 4th down conversion. Either way, 1 for 10 on 3rd down. The top 3rd down offense before the game. Heading into the week, the Falcons are the top 3rd down offense in the league. The Vikings top 3rd down defense in the league. If that sounds familiar, that's exactly what it was like before the Rams game. And the Vikings did a fantastic job of holding the Rams down, and they did an even better job of holding the Falcons down to having a 10% 3rd down conversion rate. Which I guess, Charles Davis, you're right. 3rd and long was pretty advantageous for the Vikings.
While we're calling a spade, you're right. Also, quit saying that phrase. He wouldn't even use like a different word. He kept on just using the word advantage. Like, have I used advantage yet today? I can't remember if did I call it an advantage, or where's my thesaurus at?
But yeah, that was a huge part of the game. Their ability to force, 4th downs, because Matt Bosher's a pretty good punter, but and the Vikings punt return game was. I'm not gonna say it was non-existent. They did return some punts, but it wasn't like. Marcus Sherrills wasn't, lighting up the world or anything like that. Love him, but in this game he wasn't lighting up the world, and I thought he made like even one mistake in calling for a fair catch on. The announcers called it a booming punt. I thought he outkicked his coverage. But either way, it was a fair catch. So it doesn't really matter. Sherrills is one of the top punt returners that the league has seen in the past 5 years, and no one will recognize that, but that's fine. So I'll trust him. But yeah, it was really important because it created better field position, especially when the Vikings punting was pretty good. That allowed them to set up a couple of scores, and it forced field goals, right? Because the Vikings therefore were perfect in the red zone. In the rare cases where the Falcons were able to get to the red zone, they got to the Minnesota 20 once, which in NFL statistics does not count as a red zone attempt, and they got to the 19 once, which was a field goal. So. And the Vikings did a pretty fantastic job. And, some people will ask well, we should figure out why, the Vikings were so good on third down. Cause it's one thing to say, one of the elements to winning football is to prevent them from converting third down. It's always difficult to figure out why. Some of it has to do with the Falcons. Some of it has nothing to do with the Vikings. And that's how often the Falcons penalized themselves and put themselves in a bad position, even after you account for sort of how shoddy the reffing was in that game. The Falcons also did a pretty poor job of being disciplined, and there was a lot of penalties, and they're at home, so you feel like, there really shouldn't be a lot of excuses or distractions that they're not used to, but a lot of penalties from the Falcons, a lot of really confusing stuff from Mike Zimmer too. I want to bring that up. They did a pretty good job of shutting people down, especially, Trey Waynes had a great game. Harrison Smith had another freaking phenomenal game. Andrew Sandeo had a really good game. And so, yeah, those are all elements to what the Vikings did. They were very aggressive in their blitz packages like they were against the Rams, like they haven't been for most of the year this year. And that kind of change up, I think, was part of the reason, Matt Ryan panicked so often and so on. The one player that, besides Eric Kendricks that I've already mentioned, that didn't play so hot was Xavier Rhodes. And I kind of want to rant about this, so I'm going to do that.
Let's take a second and handle this. And let's also remember that he was limping a bit during the game and ended up, ended up on his back on the sidelines holding his leg. So this might have something to do with his calf. But so
right.
Let's talk about Xavier.
Right. Okay. So I had mentioned after the game that Xavier Rhodes had a poor game. Could be because of injury. And I mentioned that, and, maybe he's still recovering or something like that. But it does us a disservice, I think, to say a player had a good game because of one box score statistic and his overall reputation. Xavier Rhodes has a well-deserved reputation as being one of the top cornerbacks in the NFL. That's fine. It is true. Julio Jones only had 2 catches for 24 yards. That's great. Xavier Rhodes actually did not shadow Julio all that often in this game. And I think he'd kind of intimated sort of last week that he was going to shadow him all game. And I think that was going to be the game plan. But I think that injury thing kind of came up. And so they figured out different coverage solutions for Julio. And that mostly worked. And I say mostly because Julio probably should have had 2 more catches. I think he had 2 drops. He certainly had 1 high profile drop. And I think he had another drop. If not, it's like Marvin Hall and Mohamed Sanu or something like that. But those drops are the fault of Xavier Rhodes. They're not the fault of the defense, and they're the fault of Julio Jones, not Xavier Rhodes, not the defense. And people have gotten, at Pro Football Focus, at me, at a couple of other analysts, and some other people have been like, well, you have to understand sort of. And one of these people, love him to death, Matt Waldman. We have him on the show every so often. He produces my favorite sort of dynasty analysis report. He's taught me a lot about evaluating football, so I don't want to, bag on him too much. But he and a bunch of other people, you have to understand sort of the context of what his assignment is, which is, true. But you have to, if you're going to say that, you have to tell us what you think that his assignment is and how he performed in that role, because it is true that Julio Jones was only kept to 2 for 24, but Xavier Rhodes covered a number of receivers in that game because they abandoned sort of this shadowing coverage. And that resulted in 8 targets, which is really high for Xavier Rhodes. He had 8 targets in that game. He allowed 4 completions, which is about average for a cornerback, bad for Xavier, average for a cornerback. But I think 2 drops in his coverage, so he should have allowed 6. That's actually really bad. He had a really bad game. And maybe it's not, a fair evaluation of the kind of player he should have been because he was injured or whatever, but it's a fair evaluation of the fact that he was on the field and was expected to perform a job and he didn't do that well. And some people are like, well, he's up against Julio Jones. Jones is that he did as good a job as you can expect anyone to do against Julio. And I think that's a cop-out. Like, a lot of people are saying this, and it's like, you don't automatically do a good job because you played against a good player. And that's exactly how people are treating it. That well, because he was up against a good player, he did a good job. And it's like, that's not friggin' true. Like, it is important for us to kind of adjust for level of competition when we're evaluating the true talent level of someone. And that's fine. But Xavier Rhodes played like a poor cornerback does when put up against a good receiver, not like a good cornerback against a good receiver. He's been up against a bunch of good receivers. He's been up against Julio before, did a better job in both of his previous games against Julio Jones, did a better job against Odell, did a better job against Antonio Brown. Like, he did a better job against Calvin Johnson. Like, he's done a better job against high-level receivers and mid-level receivers than he did against Julio. And people are just like, well, it's Julio, so obviously, Julio's going to get his. But, I think, Xavier Rhodes did as good a job as you can imagine. And it's like, no,
I feel like Matt Ryan had more to do with how poorly Julio Jones did on Sunday than Xavier Rhodes.
Yeah, they never targeted him, and that wasn't because of Xavier doing blanket coverage. He wasn't even on him most of the game. So, yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with Matt Ryan. And for some reason, Matt Ryan didn't trust Julio to, like, win against Mackenzie Alexander, which I don't want to, like, bag on Mackenzie Alexander. He actually had a great game, but, like, I'm picking Julio in that matchup.
Mackenzie Alexander had that great play that if he would have been one step further, he could have run back as a pick six. Like, Mackenzie Alexander had a couple of great plays.
His second career, including college, interception.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I thought that pass interference was not a good call. But, that's something where I think the camera angles make it difficult for me. So it actually may have been a good call, but the evidence I'm presented with tells me that it probably wasn't. But I'll acknowledge that was incomplete evidence. But I thought it was pretty good coverage anyway. Either way, Mackenzie Alexander had a great game. Terrence Newman had a pretty good game. Waynes had a good game. Xavier Rhodes did not. And it's okay for us to say that. It's okay for us to consider him one of the best cornerbacks in the league. And it's okay for a cornerback to have a bad game while the primary receiver that we are told he's supposed to cover, also does not produce statistically. Those things can all be true. And I think Matt Ryan and I want to say Sarkisian is a big part of why Julio didn't produce statistically. Also, a couple Julio drops. But I don't think the reason is Xavier Rhodes. And I think we can be smart enough and comfortable enough in knowing that Xavier Rhodes is a top cornerback for us to say that. I don't know why we have to defend, when a good player has a bad game. You don't have to do it. He's a good player. That's okay.
No, it seems reasonable. And watching the game, you could notice that Xavier was not on Julio Jones for most of the game either.
It was a 20-yard completion to Marvin Hall over Xavier Rhodes, and you want to be like, yeah, the Vikings actually, they decided to have him shadow this undrafted free agent. It was his first start of the year. Not everyone's Adam Thielen, man. Marvin Hall had a 20-yard catch against Xavier Rhodes. That's not great.
The Vikings Twitter account just has all these great Rhodes clothes GIFs and pictures that they're dying to post after every game. So they needed to drive the narrative. Damn it, they needed to post that.
Yeah, and I get it, and
it's clever.
The easy argument is there, 2 for 24, but he had a bad game. He'll be better. It's fine. And you're right, maybe he was injured.
Yeah, maybe. Let's go to the mailbag. And have a couple of great mailbag questions here. Eric Olson asks via email, I've obviously been enjoying this season. I'm not sure what to do with all my hopes and dreams for Teddy Bridgewater. If he doesn't play at all this season, what is his market value and the likelihood that the Vikings re-sign him?
Man, I have no idea what his market value is. I wouldn't be surprised if So here's one of the problems with Bridgewater. So obviously, the injury complicates things. The fact that he's not playing this year complicates things. A lot of things complicate things, obviously. One of the problems is that he was not well regarded by the NFL community coming out of the draft and after his rookie year. And I am totally comfortable admitting that because I think that they were wrong. But that will complicate things because for players like rookies in general, a lot of general managers will not. They'll get a report from their pro scouting department, but unless that player kind of has a big year, say like Nick Foles or Case Keenum or something like that, they'll bias pretty heavily towards their pre-draft evaluation, which is something we saw. I think I remember every year, like in 2014 and 2015, And I think in 2016, there were polls of NFL GMs like, who are the best young quarterbacks in the NFL, and Teddy Bridgewater always ended up sort of at the bottom of these polls. And I think that's some evidence we can use. Plus the fact that he fell all the way to 32 in the first round, and some people evidently thought that the Vikings actually did a poor job of even drafting him there. That's all good evidence that the NFL didn't covet Teddy Bridgewater that much anyway, which is dumb and wrong, but is also, going to depress his value when he hits the open market when we don't have, 2 years of data of his ability to play. The last year that we have is 2015. Statistically, that year doesn't pop out because NFL GMs will say that they value things like, third down conversion ability and they value mobility and they value kind of leadership. And very often, while that's true, they also value statistics that do not give us a good picture of how a player has the ability to perform in the future, like total touchdowns, total yard. I mean, some NFL GMs still talk in total yards, even though they know that in-game play calling is dictated by situation, right? Like, I think it was Phillip Rivers who said, I don't care about total passing yards. If you look at who had more passing yards in a game, just as often as not, the team with more passing yards lost. And so I don't know why you would use total passing yards to evaluate a quarterback. I think it might have been Phillip Rivers. And, someone ran the numbers and, it's 53% of the time, like the team with more passing yards lost. And so, because you're passing to try and catch up. And so, NFL GMs will use a lot of these really poor statistics to put a value on a player, and try and sign him. So I think that his value will actually probably be below, if he's not going to play this year, the Mike Glennon contract, which is basically our Mendoza line now.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's how we're talking about everything, right?
We think that Eli might get more than that, but Bridgewater would probably get less. Right.
Yeah. Everything is evaluated in terms of this, because it actually Glennon is a 200 batter. That's perfect. Everything is evaluated in terms of contract value by the Mike Glennon contract now. And so if that's going to be our point of reference, I think Bridgewater is going to get less than that, despite the fact that he's young, despite the fact that he had, I think he showed a ton in the 2016 preseason, and he's shown a ton throughout his career. If the Vikings want to sign both, I mean, Case Keenum is probably going to get a ton of money. I think, what's the rumor now that Washington wants to sign him for $5,105 or something like that, like something absurd. That rumor is probably unfounded, but it speaks to sort of how he has a market, despite the fact that this is going to be an unusual market where a bunch of quarterbacks are going to hit. But because Tyrod and Case and Kirk and I guess Teddy and Sam.
And Eli, presumably,
Eli now.
Eli is going to end up throwing himself in there, which is
and also Alex Smith might be traded, which impacts sort of that kind of market too. So
either way, Denver's going to find their new quarterback.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Jacksonville's going to find it's Eli. Never mind.
Jacksonville's going to find Eli. That somehow seems more predestined than that whole Tebow to Jacksonville thing that never happened. This is destiny.
Yeah. But yeah, so I don't know what Teddy's value is going to be, but I think it's going to be lower than what a lot of people expect.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's possible to sign both just because Teddy's value below. But we want to be careful because the Arizona Cardinals, we don't want to be the Cardinals in terms of quarterback cap space.
No.
The Arizona Cardinals by far have the highest percentage of cap devoted to quarterbacks, and it's not working out.
And it certainly hasn't been working out, and neither is the health of their court. Let's just throw everything at the quarterback who's about to turn 40 and is just in real rough shape every single year and seems to get knocked out every single year while we're like progressing. Yeah.
But we got this tight end as a backup quarterback, so
he's gonna be great. He'll be the next he'll be the next Carson Palmer. It'll be fine.
Yeah, right.
Dan on Twitter asks, probably one of our best questions of the week, possibly of the year. How do you think the season will come crashing down? That sounds like the Hulk Hogan theme song there for a second. Please answer on podcast. Let's do it board game clue style. I believe it will be Forbath in the NFC title game with a mixed point after. Love the show. Already bracing for the worst. Thanks.
This is great.
Yeah.
I would say, I think it'll Well, because I'm the protagonist of reality, it'll hurt me in a particular way. So it'll be against the Eagles in the NFC Championship game.
Oh, good.
And so I think it will be Case Keenum with a fumble in the NFC Championship game. And the reason it's a fumble is because he has not fumbled the ball yet.
Oh.
Right?
I like that one. That's... I can see something like that. I can see something like that happening. I'm going to go with Xavier Rhodes in the second round with the torn calf muscle. Like him, like all of a sudden, like all of the like bend but not break stuff that's been happening with him over the past several games, like that ends up being the one thing that like it completely knocks him out for the rest of the playoffs. And even if we end up winning, it ends up being the reason we end up losing the conference championship.
Now I'm getting irrationally nervous because of the Mike Remmers thing.
Oh no. Why did we answer this question?
Oh,
why was this question so good?
Now that we've lampshaded the fact we've, I think, 2 podcasts in a row predict the future. I think now that we've lampshaded it, it's not possible. So
okay, good.
It's okay. We're fine.
Yeah, let's just take a deep breath, relax. Nothing that we just said is going to happen. I'll save that for the Christmas episode. Kenneth Allen asks, what would Arif hate more? Wentz winning the Super Bowl and Super Bowl MVP, or Wentz switching spots with Prince Harry to usher in a new age of the UK monarchy, where he somehow gets even more press than he does now. Prince Wentz also bequeaths NDSU $1 billion, making them dominant forever.
So I definitely would have picked the second one, but that $1 billion thing is it's tough.
I'm just trying to imagine NDSU with more money right now. Because I drive to Fargo fairly often, so I'm just trying to imagine NDSU having more money and being more obnoxious.
Well, it would get them out of the friggin' marshmallow they play in, right? That's good for everybody.
It's not really a marshmallow. Like, the top of that dome isn't really, like... That thing is kind of a dome in name only. Like, it's a weird building.
It's ugly. It's awful. And if they moved out of it into a new stadium, I don't even care if it gives them a slight competitive advantage to do so. I would be absolutely in favor of it. It's such an ugly stadium.
It was ugly in the mid-'90s when it was made, and it's certainly ugly now. Actually, I think it was early 90s that the Fargo Dome became a thing. I'd have to check that, but I feel like...
Why, though? Like, I get that, like, yeah, we'd play in the snow, and it wouldn't be ideal for us to, like, even though the college season ends pretty early, it wouldn't make sense for us to like have an outdoor stay. Like, I get that.
Well, their season never seems to end because they always end up in the playoffs. But let's
not when they built it.
No, definitely not when they built it. No, this was definitely they will outgrow that place very quickly.
So if NDSU, so I still have to answer this. So if NDSU gets $1 billion, I think they will still have trouble recruiting, even if they move into the FBS like they should, if they're not cowards. What?
You know,
they
it was
keep on
great.
Bragging about how they beat FBS teams. Why don't you like put a schedule together? Like, I'm just saying.
You know what was great was on being on Twitter yesterday while Eric Thompson was cheering against Carson Wentz.
That was amazing.
That was top 5 Twitter of the year right there. It was every time he'd mention something about how well the Seahawks were playing, there'd be some apology to Carson Wentz.
Right. So had Wisconsin Whitewater not lost their coach a couple years ago, I would say they should move up from a Division III into Division II. But Mount Union should move up from Division III to Division II, and NDSU should move from the FCS to FBS. And I think those are the only strong these teams should move takes I have.
Yeah,
right, like that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Also, along the lines of Carson Wentz, Flag Husband on Twitter asks, does Wentz smell like a gym bag or like a Subway restaurant? Really wish Dusty was here because Dusty worked at a Subway at one point.
Yeah, this would have been perfect for Dusty. We'll ask him anyway.
Yeah, we'll ask him on the next episode.
Yeah, but I'm going to say like a Subway because that would be more confusing.
He just walks around constantly smelling of baked bread.
Yeah, right. Like if he if you smell like Subway has a lot more smells than baked bread.
Well, yes.
Most of them bad. But if you smelled like a gym bag, everyone would be like, "Well, you should take a shower." But this makes sense. Like, no one would be like, "Yeah, it's okay, that makes sense."
Why do you smell like overcooked meatballs? Like, why is that a thing?
Yeah, right.
How? You
definitely smell like a kitchen cleaner, but I can't identify which one, which is weird because I know it is one.
Kenneth Allen on Twitter asks, what changed between the first half case and the second half case? I know he wasn't perfect in the second half despite the passer rating, but it seemed like he played a lot better.
I think a lot of it had to do with play calling, and I'm not saying that Shurmur took the game out of Case's hands because he was playing horribly. I think a lot of it had to do with, what the Falcons were giving up. I think that the cover 3 defense that they have is very vulnerable to throwing short into the outside, which is what they started doing a lot more in the second half. I think a lot of it also was to relieve pressure on that offensive line, which is giving up a lot of pressure. And Case did, play a little better too. So I think that those are the things that changed. I think the play calling was a big part of it, which, man, we're not going to have Shurmur for very long, I guess.
Yeah, not at this rate anyway.
Yeah.
Luke Braun asks, does this game signal a new, more confident and creative Latavius Murray?
Maybe. I think that he's been playing, pretty confidently for the past couple of games. And his ankle's healthy and that's pretty obvious and stuff like that. But yeah, no, it's, he's playing well. Like he's playing, I'm not going to say at the level he was playing at when he made the Pro Bowl, which, that was, a bit much anyway. Maybe he shouldn't have made it that year, but still. But he seems to be returning to kind of the back that he was, which is pretty cool.
Along the same lines as that question, let's pull up another Murray question. Kyle Slabby asks, does Murray have an awkward running style? Is it a form of like a drunken master style running that throws off defenders and their tackling trajectory? Is that how Murray misses tackles?
Yeah, I think kind of. So whenever I think of an awkward running style that enables a quarterback, the first person I think of is Marshawn Lynch, who kind of like duck walks everywhere and takes these like wide strides, but because of the way his feet lands, he could just be going in any direction. Like, it's very difficult to predict what direction he would go in. And so, his duck walking ends up with, like, he could go straight, he could go to the right, or maybe he could even go to the left when he lands on, like, his left foot. Like, it's weird, and it's very difficult to predict what he'll do, and it gives them an extraordinary amount of balance. Not to compare Murray to Marshawn Lynch or anything like that. But I think that he's got a little bit of that. Not, I think, a ton. I think the fact that he tripped and recovered on his big run, it makes it easy for us to get that impression. But I think he does have like a little bit of it where his running style is not completely orthodox and it does throw some people off. But just in general, I think that really what's happening is that he's got, some pretty good balance, and it is a little hard to figure out what he's going to do. But, Marshawn never used like a jump cut to cut. Like, he always just moved. And Murray seems pretty comfortable with the jump cut. So, there's a lot, I think, a different set of tools in that toolbox.
Yeah. Alex Goebel asks, am I crazy or is Nick Easton really bad at setting up screenplays?
You're not crazy. Both Elflein and Easton are really high variance players on the offensive line. And so both of them have some really good plays and both of them have some really bad plays. I think Elflin's really good plays are a little bit more obvious because he's very often down the field on a screen on those good plays. Easton is just not as good. I wouldn't, maybe you're right, but from my initial impression, I wouldn't say that he's particularly bad at it, but that he doesn't seem to have a particular specialty at it like other inconsistent offensive linemen do. You know who's really good at setting up screens? Matt Khalil. He was amazing at it entire career.
That's an odd thing for him to be really good at, considering he seems to be terrible at everything else.
Right, exactly. But yeah, Easton, I just think he's really inconsistent, and so he's going to be really bad at it sometimes, really good at it some other times. Like, he's been really good pushing players downfield and setting up linebackers and getting through on inside runs if he did have a specialty, but overall he's been inconsistent, so I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. Alex Boret asks, can we keep winning tough games against good teams without any defensive or special teams touchdowns or field flipping plays? Or is our suffocating defense just not built to create them? I feel like it's only just the last couple of games where we haven't done much in the way of defensive scoring.
I mean, we haven't had much in terms of defensive scoring all year. I want to say we've like one or two defensive scores in general, but that's fine. Defensive scores are rare, low frequency events that, kind of by the nature of football, sometimes feel like they come in bunches. Kind of like what's happening with the Jaguars right now, aside, Yannick Ngakoue has a really good case to make the Pro Bowl based off like his 5 forced fumbles, 3 of which I think have been returned for touchdowns and stuff like that. And that's great. And I think it's a repeatable skill he has, turning his sacks into forced fumbles. I don't think he's ever going to have a year like this one again in terms of total forced fumbles. He may have better years as a sack artist. He may have better years as a defensive end. But I think he's already, kind of hit the limit of what he can do because of variance. So he may get 1 or 2 more this year or something like that. But I think that it's going to come, quote unquote, crashing down, even though he's going to be a better player, and it's going to be fine. And I think it's kind of the same thing. The Vikings are in like a bit of a drought in terms of defensive scoring. But it's like whatever. And the fact that the Vikings defense still has the ability to be sort of this good and prevent this many points and put opponents into such difficult spots and keep them out of the red zone in particular, I think is a sign of its greater sustainability. I think this is an instance where the Vikings are likely to regress upwards in terms of turnover production, potentially defensive scoring, and so on. So, last year the Vikings were kind of, I'm not going to say I hate saying that, but the Vikings were set up to regress very harshly towards a mean of not having defensive scores. This year they're set to regress pretty mildly, but still regress, I think, forward in the direction of turnovers. Plus, they're like still +4 in takeaways, which is like kind of weird for a defense that doesn't get a ton of interceptions. I don't think it's the defensive setup, by the way, that is making turnovers less likely. I think it's just kind of a product of variance.
Just kind of odd luck sort of thing?
Yeah.
Let's go with Miles Swami, who asks, if the Vikings were a 90s hip-hop / R&B song, what would they be?
Holy crap, what a...
I've got mine. Right. I'm curious as to what yours is going to be, but I've got mine.
I Believe I Can Fly by R. Kelly.
Wow, you went straight off of the soundtrack for it was the Bugs Bunny Space Jam. Yeah, you went straight off of Space Jam there, huh?
It is not particularly inspired for me to take a song from a sports movie and apply it to sports. No. I understand that.
But if you're going to take one, you might as well take it from that one. But
yeah, I mean, like, here's the thing. The Vikings over-under by Vegas was 8.5. And I said take the over. I think they'll win 9.
Yep.
Right? And people are like, Arif, 9. That's like, I think they'll win 10. But no one thought they would win 10 by 12 games.
During this segment, I have that song stuck in my head now. I can achieve it if I can see it.
Exactly right. And Sam Bradford goes down, Dalvin Cook goes down, and you're like, yeah, this sucks. You start out 2-2, have like some pretty bad losses, have a fluke win that you don't feel comfortable, is repeatable. Mm-hmm. And so you're left with like, well, they did well against the Saints, but I guess the Steelers kicked our ass. Like, it was like.
They did well against the Saints in like the early version of the Saints. Like.
Yeah, right. It's also a difference. Like, no one felt confident that like this was the Saints team. They're like, yeah, I guess the offense isn't as good as it used to be, but the Vikings defense did well. But that defense is trash. This is the worst defense in the league. Now it's like one of the best.
Yeah.
But it was a totally different Saints team, and so you just didn't really feel like this team had anything, right? And then I guess they can fly. I don't know.
Like, I'm going to get lost in the analogy at some point. Point is, it's Brian McKnight's I Believe I Can Fly. Was that McKnight or was that R. Kelly?
No, it's R. Kelly.
That was R. Kelly.
Yeah, he wrote it, too. He wrote it, produced it, sang it. Probably peed on someone in the process.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was probably about a 16-year-old, but that's kind of beside the point. I was going to go with the classic and underrated, I feel, No Diggity. I was going to
So
go.
when we were discussing this before the show, I'd kind of mentioned it in passing, and you were like, "You cannot pick that."
It's got Teddy in it. It's got My whole thing is that it's kind of underappreciated in the whole like. In like 90s R&B, because for whatever reason, if I'm thinking of 90s R&B, the first song that ends up coming, or like 90s like rap R&B stuff, the first thing that come to my head are like the Tupac stuff, especially like California Love, and then like you start going down the list, and like somewhere eventually Blackstreet's No Diggity comes in there, but it's never high. It's never ranked high enough for me. Just go, you know, that song is to quote. Was it Aziz's character from Parks and Rec? It's a banger. You know, it's a banger, right? Like,
yeah, right.
It's there. Let's just admit that. Let's just admit it should be ranked higher up in the rankings than it is, and it's not. So it's my kind of under the radar like. And when you hear it, you know, oh, that's right. Yep, I like that song. You watch this team, you like it. It does a lot of things right, just like the song does. Even if it has that ill-advised female rap section, which you could totally jettison and nothing would be lost. Which I think is kind of like which if I was looking at like the comparative would probably be Kai Forbath. Like if we lost Kai Forbath, I don't know if much would be missing there. So it's kind of like that.
All right.
It's there. Don from Ohio asks, is the 2016 collapse a blessing in disguise for the 2017 team?
Yeah, I think so. Like, remember in the... crap, I shouldn't bring up 1998. But let's pretend the end of 1998 didn't happen.
Yes.
But late in the year... they were asked, like a member, I forget who it was. I think it was a player, not a coach, but they were asked like, hey, do you kind of regret like dropping that game? I think it was to the Bucks. Do you kind of regret dropping that game? Cause now you can't have like an undefeated season, and take one to like the 72 Dolphins or whatever. And they're like, absolutely not. Like that game taught us so much and it allowed us to kind of consistently stay engaged. And I think maybe a good sort of modern example is just Anthony Barr last year. Last year, he's coming off this like Pro Bowl, should have been all pro season. He was phenomenal. And according to himself, he didn't put as much effort in on the field or off the field to be competitive. And this year, he's consistently stayed engaged. He's focused. He's made fewer mental errors. He's been he's been around the ball a lot. And I think a lot of that has to come with, learning from your failures. And I think that this is kind of one of those examples where the team doesn't get too high on success. And they've also already experienced adversity in a way that allows them to kind of overcome it and know that, there's always going to be like a chance to win a game. So yeah, it's I think it is a blessing in disguise.
Final question is from Andy Carlson, who asks, favorite preparation of elk or venison?
So my girlfriend's a hunter, and her family hunts more than she does, but they hunt. And so we usually have an opportunity to get a lot of venison. They usually prepare beforehand. I love venison jerky. And so I've often had
venison jerky, totally underrated.
Yeah,
totally underrated.
It's amazing. I've had venison roasts, which is great. And I was talking to her. I was like, we got this question about venison. You would actually know this better than I would. What do you think? I was like, venison ossobuco would be really good because, it's a gamey meat that would take the gamey inside of it. It's kind of tough. You have the ability to kind of tenderize it. All that, right? She's like, that's fine. But sort of the best way might be to treat sort of some rib meat as a flank steak. And we've got a preparation for flank steak. You just marinate it really quickly for like an hour, and then put it directly on hot coals. No grill or anything like that. Just put it directly on hot coals, and just put it there for like 2 minutes on either side. So that's what I'm going to recommend.
I had a roommate years ago who had a deep freeze just chocked full of deer meat because every year their family would get like 4 tags. And so we just had deer meat to eat for like the entire winter. And it was wonderful never having to like buy anything else as far as like meat product, because we just always had either deer sausage or roasts or just or ground up venison. We just had all sorts of access to it. but when we were doing that, I found that the things that I was making that were really good. I actually made a like a meatball. Like I made like deer, like venison and meatballs, with a red wine sauce that was really, really tasty. It took a moment because you have a taste you get kind of like used to, and you're like, oh, it'll be like an Italian sausage sort of thing, and you bite in, you're like, no, that's different. And it took like a moment, and then it's like, oh, this is actually really delicious. A little bit of butter on that, it tasted really good. And then we also did the venison as far as jerky goes, and just like the different things you can do with venison jerky was so good. Just like it just kind of it makes you eat. If you have like some of the like regular jerky, you just sit there and just go, this isn't nearly as good as it could be. Like I feel like it's lacking, because some of these places that will dress your deer for you and process some of the jerky for you, some of the recipes are just outstanding. They're just so good.
Agreed.
Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We'll have another one later in the week with Dusty, and you guys will be going over the Carolina game and what to expect there, and talking all about the excellence that will be demanded of Matt Khalil. I almost was able to say that whole part without laughing. It was fun watching the Saints Carolina game and listening to them rip on Matt Khalil, talking about how he was a high-priced free agent and just hasn't been working out, as if any of his play over the last few years would have shown that it was going to work out for Cam Newton.
I wonder if he still owns those Pyologies. He probably still does. You really should focus on that.
The restaurants?
Yeah, they're pretty good.
I was going to say, didn't he just get sued or taken to court in the Twin Cities because of violations that were happening at those restaurants? I can't remember.
Health violations or labor violations?
I believe it was alcohol, but I'm not.
Oh,
I cannot remember.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah, that one bothers me a lot less.
Yeah. I feel like he was just in the news about some investments that he had that things weren't going well. So I couldn't remember there for a moment, but.
We'll research it, get back to you on the Carolina preview.
Yes.
Norse Code.
It's going to be all about the excellence that he demands at his restaurants. It's going to be fantastic. So we will be coming back in a few days with our preview of the Carolina Panthers game, which is going to be big. We are currently number 1 in the NFC, which I love, especially because it knocks Carson Wentz down a peg, which makes Arif happy, apparently. Is that all it takes to make you happy?
Yeah, all it takes. Well, it's asking a lot, evidently, because friggin' they lost 2 games this year, so, whatever. It was a pretty good weekend. I was 2 for 3 on the happiness thing. Vikings won, very happy. Packers won, kind of dulls the edge a little bit, but generally pretty happy. Carson Wentz lost. Yeah, pretty good again.
It's one of those like Homer Simpson feeling fine moments.
Yeah, right, exactly.
All right, so we will be coming back in a couple of days. So if you have enjoyed the show, you can do a couple of things for us. You can tell a friend about Norse Code. We are at NorseCodePodcast.com, along with the Daily Norseman as well. You can donate money to the show if you hear value in what we just did over the past hour and a half or so. You can go to paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. Maybe $1, maybe $3.50. Just try to keep the lights on. Help us with the holiday season. Help us keep the lights on. So before we go, Arif, do you have anything to plug?
Yeah, so that Trey Waynes piece I keep talking about, I'm finally going to get it published. I promise this time. I've also got a piece coming up about Cam Newton. I've talked to a couple of people who have been watching his play a lot, and I think it'll be exciting because I think Carolina is like a little bit of a mystery in terms of like who they are this year.
Yeah, so this will be that'll be a fun piece. Especially, it's been odd to watch Carolina because I've had to watch a lot of Carolina this year for some reason, and it seems one game to the next they are not the same team.
Right, exactly. It'll be fun. I've lined up a guest. We we haven't got it completely nailed down yet, so I'm not going to announce it. But I'm pretty excited.
Cool. Well, for Arif, for Dusty, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. We will be back later this week to talk Carolina. But until then, demand excellence. Demand Norse Code. And we will see you later this week.
Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, or wherever else fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, who can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. Our intrepid producer and occasional co-host James Pagachnik can be found on Twitter at Big Mono or curating the official Norse Code Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. I'm your host with a firm grasp of the obvious, Dusty O'Connell, and my name is my handle on Twitter. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, your one-time donation can be made at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Please visit our website, norsecodepodcast.com, where you'll find links to our Facebook and YouTube pages, along with the episode archive and some other good stuff. And any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be emailed to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. And on behalf of the entire Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.